The last day of February in 1975 was just a run-of-the-mill morning. The City of London was waking up, and in a small flat in the southeast, train driver Leslie Newson was getting ready for another day at work. His work bag was full of his essentials: a flask of tea, milk, coffee, and his driving manuals, wrapped up in plastic to keep them tidy. He shaved, kissed his wife, and left to catch the number 21 bus. To his wife, the only thing that was out of the ordinary that day was the £270 her husband was carrying with him, a wad of money to buy his daughter the new car she had seen at the end of his shift. Everything appeared mundane and normal. Leslie arrived at Drayton Park Station crew room just after 6 a.m. and was seen making a cup of tea in preparation for his shift. The other workers respected him. He was a cautious but friendly man and had worked up from the ranks from guard. Cup of tea in hand, he made his way to his engine. The 6-carriage train was waiting patiently at platform 3. Its 151 tons could easily carry upwards of 600 people. Leslie would have done his pre-driver checks and met his guard. The guard was a youngster, only 18 years old, and introduced himself as Robert Harris. Satisfied that everything was in order, both Robert and Leslie travelled to Moorgate. At Moorgate, both driver and guard alighted and made their way to the signal box. Signalman Walter Wade was on duty and offered both Leslie and Robert a cup of tea. As they drank, the three men discussed plans for the weekend. To the signalman, as he watched the driver and guard leave, everything was completely normal. The morning went smooth. Leslie and Robert were making good time, and passengers were fussing about their morning commute. The train was partially full, with many of the commuters making their way to the first 3 carriages, with the first and second carriage as standing room only. This would be Leslie's and Robert's 4th and final run from Dragon Park to Moorgate before a well-earned break at 9 a.m. The guard waves to the foreman and they depart 30 seconds late. At 8:45, the train has reached Old Street, the final stop before Moorgate. Once again, apart from the few seconds of delay, nothing was untoward, and the train leaves half full with the majority of the 300 passengers in the first 3 carriages. Robert, being the teenager he was getting bored. He decides to leave his position and head to the rear cab in the hopes of finding an old newspaper. Robert looked up from the paper in alarm at the unexpected engine's roar. They should have been slowing down, not speeding up. They were 500 yards from the Moorgate station, and most drivers would slow down and coast the engine to a gentle stop, not surge ahead. Robert knew he was powerless. There was an emergency brake, but because it was at the other end of the carriage, there was no way he would be able to reach it in time. His face paled, as he knew what lay ahead at the end of platform 9. On platform 9, passengers saw the lights of the approaching engine, and they could tell straight away the train was going too fast. They scrambled away from the platform's edge, fearing the train would mount the platform. Some could see Leslie staring straight ahead, oblivious to everything around him. The screams of the passengers filled the air as the train ploughed through a red warning light, and with a massive boom, the screams of passengers were mixed with the screech of bending and twisting metal, and a large cloud of 70-year-old soot and dirt engulfed the station. To understand how the accident happened, you need to understand the station itself. Platform 9 of Moorgate Station, from the passenger point of view, looks like any other station. However, unlike many stations, the tunnel at the end of Platform 9 went on for only 60 feet before there was a 2-foot sand drag and large hydraulic buffers. The tunnel itself is walled by solid rock and concrete. The force of the impact against the buffers forces the first carriage to leave the tracks. The second carriage, still carrying on at 40 miles an hour, ploughs into the first, forcing the carriage upwards, crushing it against the solid wall, and the rear of the second carriage is crushed by the third. By the time the smoke and dust is clearing, The 150 feet that made up those 3 coaches were crushed to a mere 70 foot. The last 3 carriages were untouched, and passengers that were in those 3 coaches were able to alight the train via the platform, with Robert helping to open the doors. Walter Wade, the signalman who had just hours earlier been drinking tea with Leslie and Robert, saw the whole thing and rang control for assistance. Robert moved the passengers that could walk away from the scene of the disaster. Within 10 minutes, the first ambulances began to arrive. The paramedics, seeing the stream of dazed and dirty passengers, headed straight for platform 9, not knowing what lay ahead. The fire brigade would follow a few minutes later. The soot and the dust stung the men's throats as they shone their torches in the entrance to the tunnel. Seeing the carnage, they shout to the passengers in the hope they find someone alive. Amazingly, the men were staggered to hear the passengers call back. Both the fire brigade and the ambulance wasted no time and set up a triage centre in the middle of the platform. As the fire brigade waded into the mess, they dragged out the injured into the arms of doctors who assessed their injuries and made them comfortable. Doctors raced from the station to the nearby drugstore, Boots, who freely gave up any supplies the paramedics would need. One by one, the passengers were removed. Less than 90 minutes after the accident, more than 100 fire officers were on the scene, many of which worked during the Blitz, using blowtorches, small cutters, or whatever they could fit to cut the metal away to free the passengers. They had cleared the 3rd carriage and surmised that only 40 passengers remained trapped. Some passengers, despite being trapped, escaped with relatively minor injuries. Others were not so lucky. The fire brigade officer in charge of documenting the incident captured some of the most distressing scenes to ever be captured on camera. Passengers sitting normally in their seats, some still holding their briefcases, and some holding onto the ceiling straps as if waiting to alight, all of them still, all of them dead. Naturally, these photos have never been released. By 11 a.m, the focus of the firemen had shifted from the recovery of the injured to the retrieval of bodies. There were still survivors to be rescued, but the cries from the passengers were getting less and less. A makeshift surgical ward had been erected on platform 11, where most of the severely injured were now getting treatment. The fire brigade were now facing, though, another problem. With the lack of trains, the heat in the tunnel was rising. There was no fresh air, and men had to strip to their waists to work. Some had tried to use fans, but this only stirred up the disturbed soot and dust. Many had to be relieved after just 20 minutes in the tunnel for fear of heat exhaustion, and the Salvation Army was arriving to treat the firemen for eye irritation caused by the soot. It was now 6 hours after the crash. Only 2 surviving passengers remained trapped. One is 19-year-old Margaret Lyles, a newly sworn-in police officer, and 27-year-old Jeff Benton, who works in the stock exchange. Both were trapped together. If Margaret moved, then Jeff would scream in agony. Margaret had lost feeling in her left foot and could do nothing about it. She was asked if she wanted a female officer to be with her to keep her calm. "I'd rather have one of the lads," she said, still maintaining her young sense of humour. All around them, firefighters were desperately trying to free them, and came to the conclusion that the only thing pinning them both was Margaret's numb left foot. It was agreed to amputate. Margaret was sent straight to hospital, but Jeff, who had forced to be witness to Margaret's amputation, while conscious when he was released, would succumb to his injuries just a month after the accident. While Margaret and Jeff were being rescued, the public were doing their part too. A line of almost 2,000 strong formed outside Moorgate, each person willing to give blood to aid to those that needed it. The Salvation Army had also set up a station so weary rescuers could be served tea and rest, and an emergency switchboard was created to take calls from anxious relatives. At 10 p.m, just 2 hours after Jeff and Margaret had been rescued, the rescuers called everyone for silence. Apart from the creaking metal, no other sounds could be heard. The site medical officer concluded that anyone remaining on the train would have been unlikely to survive. It took 6 days to clear the site of the bodies. They found Leslie Nielsen 4 days after the crash, still in the cab. The cab itself had been compacted from 3 feet to just 10 inches. His hands were still at the controls and had made no attempt to stop or even instinctively cover his face. The inquiry began in earnest, and it was concluded very quickly that there was no fault to the train, signal, tracks, or anything that would have prevented Leslie from stopping. It was concluded that the accident lay in the lap of the driver. When the investigators looked at Leslie's personal knife, he had no indication he was unhappy or wanted to harm himself or the train. An autopsy showed that he had a small amount of alcohol in his body, but the body had begun to decompose due to the heat, and the alcohol was attributed to this. The only other explanation towards his actions lie with medical. The vast majority of trains are fitted with a switch called a deadman. This is a pedal or a lever that must be used by the driver in order to power the train. This way, if the driver was to be incapacitated through medical means, then the weight on the deadman would be released, stopping the train. In Leslie's case, many have theorized that Leslie may have had a rare medical condition that may have caused her body to freeze up, while others have said that he suffered a seizure and he was unable to move. It will never really be known what happened to Leslie, but at an inquiry, a verdict of accidental death was recorded for all 43 that perished, including himself. In 2013, a memorial to the 43 that perished was erected in Finsbury Square. It was and remains the worst disaster to ever hit the underground during peacetime. Moorgate has had its own plaque at the station where families can also pay their respects to be close to loved ones. It was a disaster that should never have been, but one we will never fully know the answers to. Next time, big hair, big shoulder pads, and big attitude greet us as we look into the 1980s. With the Conservatives now in power and the underground facing big cuts, it has to do something big to entice passengers. But just how unions would react were plans for a one-person train.